At midnight, the elevator doors of a quiet Denver hospital opened, and a wounded German shepherd stepped out alone. Blood stained its fur, and a small device flashed on its collar. Minutes earlier, its owner had been attacked in a dark alley, and the dog had escaped carrying the only evidence. No one heard the sounds of the crime that night, but this loyal dog refused to let the truth disappear. What happened next shook the entire hospital. Before we begin, let me know where you started watching in the comments. This story isn't meant to be read alone. Share in the comments what touched your heart. Cold wind swept through the quiet streets of Denver, and inside St. Luke's Hospital, the emergency corridor glowed under pale fluorescent lights, humming softly in the stillness of a deep winter midnight. Sarah Mitchell sat behind the nurse's station with a pen resting loosely between her fingers, the quiet rhythm of the night shift wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. She was 32, tall and slender in a way that made her movements look graceful even when she was tired. Long chestnut hair was tied into a loose bun behind her head, though a few strands had escaped and brushed the sides of her pale, freckled face. Her eyes were a soft hazel, observant and calm, the kind of eyes that had learned to read pain before a patient even spoke. Sarah had not always been this steady. 5 years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a car accident that no one had seen coming. The grief had carved something deep inside her, but instead of breaking her, it had quietly reshaped her life. She had left a comfortable clinic job and chosen emergency care, the place where seconds mattered and where sometimes, just sometimes, a stranger could still be saved. Since then, she had carried herself with a quiet patience that her coworkers admired. Never loud, never dramatic, but always the one who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. Tonight had been unusually quiet. No sirens, no trauma calls, just the faint buzzing of overhead lights and the distant beeping of heart monitors from the ICU floor above. Sarah leaned back slightly in her chair and finished writing a note in a patient's chart. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe the night might stay peaceful. Then she heard it. Ding! The sound of the elevator arriving echoed down the empty corridor. Sarah lifted her head automatically, expecting perhaps a late-night visitor or an orderly returning from another floor. The elevator doors slid open slowly with a mechanical whisper. At first, she saw nothing but darkness inside the metal box. Then, something moved. A large German shepherd stepped forward. The dog staggered as it crossed the threshold, its powerful body trembling with exhaustion. Its coat was thick and dark sable, though patches of it were clumped with drying blood and dust. Even through the harsh hospital lighting, Sarah could see how badly it was injured. One shoulder sagged unnaturally, and each step left a faint smear of red across the polished floor tiles. For a moment, Sarah's mind refused to understand what she was seeing. Dogs did not take elevators, but this one had. The shepherd was enormous, easily 70 pounds, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with the broad chest and muscular frame of a working dog. Yet now that strength looked like it was barely holding together. Its ears, usually proud and upright in the breed, drooped slightly from fatigue. Still, its eyes were sharp. Amber eyes, focused, searching. They locked on to Sarah. The dog took another step forward and then another, its claws clicking weakly against the floor. Around its neck was a thick black collar, and attached to the side of it was something strange. A small, metallic device about the size of a deck of cards. A tiny red light blinked slowly on its surface. Sarah's heart began to pound. Hey there, she murmured instinctively, rising from her chair. She moved slowly, careful not to startle the animal. Years of emergency work had taught her that fear could live in any wounded creature, human or otherwise. But the shepherd didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it seemed to watch her with a kind of desperate focus, as though it had been searching for exactly this moment. The dog reached the center of the hallway. Then its legs gave out. The heavy body collapsed onto the tile floor with a dull thud. Sarah rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside it. Up close, she could see the wound clearly now. A deep gunshot injury near the shoulder, the fur around it dark with blood. The dog's breathing came in short, shallow bursts, each inhale sounding like it hurt. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Her eyes flicked back to the collar device, the blinking red light reflected in the glossy surface of the floor. It wasn't just a tracker. It looked like a recording device. Maybe even a camera. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly. With the last of its strength, it nudged the device gently against Sarah's hand. Not by accident. On purpose. Then its head fell back to the floor. Sarah's training snapped into place. "Dr. Harris," she shouted toward the emergency wing. "I need help out here." "Now!" Footsteps echoed somewhere down the corridor, but Sarah barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the strange device still blinking on the dog's collar. Because in that moment, deep inside her chest, she felt the quiet certainty that this wounded animal had not come to the hospital by chance. It had come carrying something important. Something someone wanted found. The emergency room exploded into motion the moment the wounded German Shepherd was rushed through the swinging doors. The once quiet hospital corridor now filled with urgent voices, metal carts rattling, and the sharp smell of antiseptic rising into the cold midnight air. Sarah Mitchell jogged beside the gurney as two orderlies lifted the massive dog onto the surgical table. Up close, the animal looked even larger, its thick sable coat matted with blood and hospital light reflecting faintly in its tired amber eyes. Its breathing was shallow now, each breath trembling like it might be the last. Sarah's chest tightened. She had seen many trauma cases in this hospital, but something about this animal felt different. The dog had not arrived by accident. It had come with purpose. Dr. Michael Harris pushed through the double doors a moment later. Michael Harris was a man who looked like he had been carved from granite. In his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with a quiet authority that calmed chaotic rooms. His dark hair was peppered with streaks of gray along the temples, and a short, rough beard framed a jawline that rarely softened. Years earlier, he had served as a combat medic during 2 tours overseas. The war had left him with a permanent steadiness, an ability to stay calm while everything around him fell apart. Many nurses joked that Dr. Harris had ice in his veins, but those who worked closely with him knew the truth. He cared deeply. He simply hid it beneath discipline. He glanced once at the dog's wound and immediately slipped into command mode. "Gunshot wound, right shoulder," he muttered. "Pulse weak. We're losing blood." The surgical lights snapped on above them. The dog stirred slightly, a low, strained whine escaping its throat as Dr. Harris examined the injury. The bullet had entered high near the shoulder blade, tearing through muscle. Blood soaked the surgical cloth beneath it. Sarah gently unbuckled the thick black collar from the dog's neck. "Careful," Harris said without looking up. "That thing's heavy." She turned the collar over in her hands. Attached to it was the strange metallic device she had noticed earlier, rectangular and smooth, no bigger than a small phone but built like military equipment. A tiny red indicator light blinked steadily. "What is this?" she whispered. Harris barely glanced at it. "Not our problem right now. Save the dog first." Sarah nodded and stepped away from the table. As the surgical team prepared anesthesia, she carried the device down the hallway toward the nurses' station. The hospital computer screens glowed softly in the dark room, casting pale blue light across the desk. She turned the object over again. It had a small data port on one side. Sarah hesitated only a moment before connecting it to the computer. The screen flickered. A file directory appeared. Her brows knit together. Video files? She clicked the first one. The footage appeared shaky and low to the ground. At first, it showed nothing but pavement rushing past, streetlights flashing above. Then Sarah realized what she was seeing. It was recorded from the dog's perspective. The camera had been mounted on the collar. Several clips showed the dog running through different parts of Denver alleys, sidewalks, empty streets glowing under winter streetlights. Her heartbeat quickened. Then she opened the final recording. The screen filled with darkness. A dim alley came into focus. Heavy breathing echoed through the audio, the same breathing she had heard moments earlier in the ER. Then shouting, a man's voice, another voice crying out. The camera jerked violently as the German Shepherd lunged forward. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. A tall man stepped into view under a flickering street lamp. He had a long, angular face and unshaven stubble shadowing his jaw. His hair was greasy and pushed back messily, and his eyes carried the cold, restless look of someone used to violence. He wore a dark leather jacket and gloves, despite the mild winter night. The man shoved someone to the ground. The victim disappeared out of frame, but the dog barked fiercely, lunging again. Then a gunshot exploded through the speakers. The video jerked wildly. The camera tilted toward the pavement. For a moment, everything was still. Then the dog began to run. The alley blurred into streaks of yellow light as the wounded animal fled. Sarah's blood ran cold. This dog hadn't simply wandered into the hospital. It had escaped a crime scene. And somehow, it had come here carrying the evidence. Behind her, the surgical doors burst open again as Dr. Harris called out down the hallway. "Sarah, we're losing him!" But Sarah barely heard the words. Her eyes remained fixed on the frozen frame on the screen, the attacker's face illuminated beneath the street lamp, because now she understood. The wounded dog hadn't come here for help alone. It had come to deliver the truth. And somewhere in Denver, the man in that video was still out there. The snow outside Denver had begun to fall more heavily, soft, white flakes drifting past the hospital windows, while inside St. Luke's emergency department, the tension in the air thickened with every passing minute. Sarah Mitchell remained frozen in front of the glowing computer screen. The video paused on the image of the attacker beneath the flickering street lamp. Her hazel eyes, usually calm and observant, now carried a sharp edge of urgency. She ran a hand through the loose strands of chestnut hair that had fallen from her bun, trying to slow her breathing. Years in emergency care had taught her how to control panic, but this felt different. This was not just another medical crisis. This was a message delivered by a dying animal. Behind her, the muffled sounds of surgical instruments clinking echoed faintly from the operating room. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped steadily, reminding her that the German Shepherd who had carried this truth through the city streets was still fighting for his life. Sarah grabbed the phone beside the computer. "Denver Police Department," the dispatcher answered. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said quickly, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'm a nurse at St. Luke's Hospital. I think I have video evidence of an assault, possibly attempted murder." Within 15 minutes, the quiet hospital corridor welcomed a new arrival. Detective Daniel Brooks stepped through the sliding emergency doors with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to walking into chaos. He was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with a posture that suggested long years of police work. His dark hair was cut short, though a faint scar ran along his right temple, disappearing into the hairline. A close-trimmed beard framed his sharp jaw, giving him a slightly weathered look. His gray eyes carried a constant alertness, the kind that rarely relaxed even off-duty. Brooks had not always been this guarded. 10 years earlier, his partner had been killed during a routine traffic stop that turned violent. Since that night, Brooks had developed a reputation inside the Denver Police Department for relentless focus. He trusted evidence more than instinct, and rarely allowed emotions to cloud his judgment. But tonight, even he seemed surprised. "You said a dog brought you this?" Brooks asked, glancing from Sarah to the paused video frame. Sarah nodded slowly. "A German Shepherd. He walked out of the elevator about 30 minutes ago, shot in the shoulder." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "And he brought the camera?" Sarah turned the screen slightly toward him and pressed play. The room filled with the shaky footage again, the alley, the shouting, the violent struggle. Brooks leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as the attacker stepped into the light. "Pause it," he said quietly. Sarah did. Brooks studied the man's face carefully. Then he rewound the clip to the moment when the attacker ran toward a car at the end of the alley. "Go frame by frame." The license plate appeared clearly for a split second. Brooks exhaled slowly. "Well, that's helpful." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and scribbled the number down. "Where's the dog now?" he asked. "In surgery," Sarah replied. "He's losing a lot of blood." Brooks glanced toward the operating room doors. For a moment, his hardened detective's expression softened slightly. That dog just handed us a suspect. As if on cue, the surgical doors opened again. Dr. Michael Harris stepped out, still wearing his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. His broad shoulders looked heavier now, and sweat darkened the edges of his graying hair. Sarah stood immediately. "How is he?" Harris rubbed a tired hand across his beard. "The bullet fragmented," he said. "We removed most of it, but the damage was severe. He's still critical." Sarah's stomach tightened. Brooks watched the exchange quietly before speaking again. "If that dog hadn't made it here," he said slowly, "we'd probably never even know this attack happened." Sarah looked back at the paused image on the screen. The attacker's face stared back at them from the frozen frame. Somewhere in the city, that man was still free. But not for long, because now the wounded German Shepherd had become something far more important than a patient. He had become the only witness, and the entire case now depended on whether that witness survived the night. The snowstorm had thickened over Denver, blanketing the city streets in a quiet layer of white, while the yellow glow of streetlights reflected off wet pavement and the long night pressed forward toward dawn. Inside St. Luke's Hospital, Sarah Mitchell stood alone outside the operating room doors, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold back the cold creeping through her chest. The tall nurse looked smaller than usual beneath the harsh hospital lights. Her chestnut hair had loosened from its bun during the chaos of the night, a few strands clinging to the pale skin of her temples. She still held the heavy black collar in her hands, the one the German Shepherd had worn when he stumbled out of the elevator. The metal device that had carried the video evidence now rested safely on the desk inside the nurse's station, but the collar remained warm in her fingers, as though the dog's strength had not yet faded from it. Across the city, Detective Daniel Brooks sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked police SUV, moving steadily through the snow-covered streets. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in rhythmic arcs, clearing the flakes that fell heavier with each passing minute. Brooks stared at the printed still frame of the attacker's face resting on his lap. Beside him behind the wheel was Officer Maria Alvarez. Maria Alvarez was one of the younger patrol officers in the Denver Police Department, bare 27 but already known for her sharp instincts. She was short compared to Brooks, with a compact, athletic build that made her movements quick and efficient. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into a practical ponytail beneath her patrol cap, and her brown eyes carried a quiet determination that came from growing up in a neighborhood where survival often meant learning to read danger early. "You really think he's still in the city?" Alvarez asked, glancing briefly toward Brooks. "He didn't expect the dog to survive," Brooks replied calmly. "People like him don't plan for witnesses." He tapped the photo again. "And he definitely didn't expect the witness to walk into a hospital." The patrol computer mounted on the dashboard beeped softly. The license plate number had finally returned a result. Alvarez leaned forward slightly. "Vehicle registered to a Robert Kane," she read aloud. 39 years old. Address in North Denver." Brooks nodded once. "Let's pay Mr. Kane a visit." The SUV turned sharply onto a narrower residential street where aging apartment buildings stood close together, their windows glowing faintly against the falling snow. The building they were looking for appeared halfway down the block, 3 stories tall, with chipped paint and a flickering hallway light above the entrance. Brooks stepped out first, pulling his coat tighter against the cold wind. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the door. Inside the building, the hallway smelled faintly of stale smoke and old carpeting. Apartment 2B. Brooks knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, harder. From inside came the sound of movement. A lock turned. The door opened just a few inches. The man standing there matched the video frame almost perfectly. Robert Kane was tall, but thin in a way that suggested long years of bad habits. His face was narrow, with unshaven stubble darkening his jawline. His pale skin looked sickly beneath the dim hallway light, and his eyes carried the restless twitch of someone used to watching over his shoulder. Greasy, dark hair hung loosely over his forehead. "What do you want?" Kane muttered. Brooks didn't raise his voice. Denver Police Department. Kane's eyes flickered. That was all the confirmation Brooks needed. Within seconds, the officers pushed the door open and stepped inside. The arrest itself was quick. Kane tried to bolt toward the back hallway, but Alvarez moved faster, grabbing his arm and forcing him against the wall. Metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon," Brooks said calmly. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the silent city. Back at St. Luke's Hospital, the operating room doors finally swung open. Dr. Michael Harris stepped into the hallway. Sarah immediately looked up. For a moment, Harris said nothing. His tired eyes met hers. Then he gave a slow nod. "He's alive," Harris said quietly. Sarah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Somewhere across Denver, the man responsible for the violence was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser. And the wounded German shepherd, the silent witness who had carried the truth across the city, was still breathing. Justice had begun to move. But the story was not finished yet, because when the dog finally woke, the truth behind that alley attack would finally come into the light. Morning arrived slowly over Denver, pale winter sunlight spreading across the snowy rooftops, while the long night finally loosened its grip on the city. Inside St. Luke's Hospital, the emergency wing had grown quiet again, though the events of the night still lingered in the tired faces of the staff who had witnessed them. Sarah Mitchell stood near the recovery ward window, watching the faint orange light of dawn reflect across the hospital parking lot. The tall nurse looked exhausted now, her slender shoulders slightly slumped beneath her pale blue scrubs. Her chestnut hair had been pulled into a loose ponytail after the long night, and faint shadows rested beneath her hazel eyes. Yet there was something softer in her expression this morning, something warmer than the tense determination that had filled the previous hours. Behind the glass partition, the German shepherd lay quietly on a recovery bed surrounded by blankets and monitoring equipment. A thick bandage wrapped around his shoulder where the bullet had torn through muscle, and a transparent tube carried fluids slowly into his body. Despite the injury, the dog still looked powerful. His large frame stretched across the bed, sable fur dark and dense even under the hospital lights. Up close, he appeared to be about 4 years old, an adult working dog in the prime of his strength, though now exhaustion had softened the sharp alertness in his amber eyes. Dr. Michael Harris approached Sarah from behind, holding a clipboard in one hand. The tall surgeon looked just as worn as the rest of the staff, the gray in his beard more noticeable beneath the morning light. Yet the stern lines of his face had relaxed slightly. "He's stable," Harris said quietly. "Strong heart. Stronger than most." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the dog. "He came all the way here," she murmured, "even after being shot." Harris leaned against the wall beside her. "Dogs like that are trained for loyalty," he said. "But this was more than training." Inside the room, the German shepherd stirred slightly. His ears twitched as if catching a distant sound, and his eyes opened just a fraction. Sarah stepped closer to the glass. The dog's gaze moved slowly across the room before settling on her. For a moment there was confusion in his eyes, the faint disorientation of an injured animal waking in a strange place. But then something shifted. Recognition, perhaps. His tail moved weakly beneath the blanket. Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "You remember me, don't you?" she whispered softly. A few hours later, Detective Daniel Brooks returned to the hospital with new information. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his coat as he stepped into the hallway outside the recovery room. "We found the victim," Brooks said, his voice quieter than usual. "A man named Thomas Reed." Sarah turned toward him. Thomas Reed, Brooks explained, was a private security contractor who had recently reported suspicious activity involving stolen equipment shipments in the Five Points district. The man who attacked him, Robert Kane, had been working with a small criminal group attempting to silence Reed before he could testify to authorities. "And the dog?" Sarah asked. Brooks glanced through the window. "Name's Atlas," he said. "Reed's partner, former military working dog." The name seemed to settle naturally into the room. Atlas, the dog who had carried the weight of truth across the city in the middle of the night. Over the next few weeks, Atlas recovered steadily. His wound healed slowly, but his strength returned day by day. Nurses began bringing him treats during their shifts, and patients often paused outside the recovery room just to watch the calm, watchful German Shepherd resting beside the window. Eventually, Atlas was strong enough to walk again. He began spending his afternoons lying near the nurses' station, greeting visitors with the quiet dignity of an animal that had already lived through more than most. But one question remained. Thomas Reed, still recovering from his injuries, would not be able to care for Atlas for many months. One evening, Sarah knelt beside the dog in the hallway. Atlas leaned gently against her shoulder, his warm weight steady and familiar. "You carried the truth all the way here," she said softly. Maybe you were meant to stay." Atlas lifted his head and looked at her, amber eyes calm and trusting. That night, Sarah Mitchell signed the adoption papers. And from that moment on, the wounded dog who once walked out of an elevator carrying evidence of a crime finally had something he had fought so hard to protect: a home. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or shining light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on four wounded legs in the middle of a silent night when the world believes everything is already lost. Atlas did not speak, yet he carried the truth when no one else could. Through pain, fear, and darkness, he kept moving, because loyalty and love were stronger than the wounds in his body. And perhaps that is how God often works in our world. Not through grand signs, but through small acts of courage placed in ordinary moments. A wounded dog walking into a hospital, a nurse who chose compassion, a truth that refused to stay hidden. These are the quiet threads of grace that remind us we are never completely alone. Even when the night feels heavy, God can send help in ways we never expect. Maybe today someone in your life needs the same kind of kindness Sarah showed that night. A small act of care, a moment of patience, a reminder that hope still exists. Because sometimes the miracle God sends to others begins with us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that loyalty, kindness, and faith still matter in this world. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether you believe God sometimes sends help through the most unexpected messengers. And if stories like Atlas remind you that goodness still lives in this world, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can hear stories that bring hope. May God bless you, protect your home, and watch over you and the people you love tonight.